The issues facing Indigenous people imprisoned are staggering. High rates of incarceration, segregation. Indigenous men and women are more likely to be classified as high security, less likely to be paroled.
It's a reminder of who you are and where you come from, and it's also healing.
While in jail, access to Indigenous spiritual services is critical. Ceremony, sweats, an elder, and smudging.
All the negativity that's in here cooped up, and when you're allowed to smudge, you can release all that, and it all goes away, and you start fresh with a fresh mind. It's very helpful.
Access to spirituality is also a charter right. Federal prisons recognize this and offer programs and services for Indigenous men and women in custody. But provincial jails are struggling to do the same. Access to programs is hit and miss, from one jail to the next. Anthony Peter Paul knows that firsthand.
Sometimes they'll allow you to practice native spirituality, or maybe there's an elder visiting there, and other times there's nothing going on.
It's still their right to be able to pray and to have sweat lodges. You know, that's our church.
What we heard from the men and women in custody was that they just don't get access to spiritual programming, to culturally appropriate programming.
What we figured along the way in the work with probations was that the mainstream programs or Western-focused programs were not working for Indigenous people.
I first met Anthony Peter Paul in early 2017. He's Mi'kmaq from the Pabonneau First Nation in New Brunswick. He'd been in and out of trouble, in and out of jail.
A lot of trouble that I got into was living on the reserve, was trouble on the reserve. There's a lot of like drug and alcohol. A lot of my incarceration is because of that. You know, I thought I got out of the system, back in the system. Here I go, and I knew I wasn't getting out. You know, breaking and enter is a pretty bad charge.
Peter Paul was sentenced in 2012 to 16 months in New Brunswick's Southeast Regional Correctional Centre. He said Bibles and church services were readily available, but his request to smudge and see an elder was denied.
We were almost segregated from our spirituality. It kind of hurt because you know, it felt racial. Like why would they help these other groups and not help us?
It wasn't the first time APTN had reported on similar complaints at the same jail.
I told her, well, it's smudge, and she's like, well, I don't know what smudge is, and I was trying to explain that, you know, it's how we pray. And
in 2014, Suzanne Patlas wanted to leave smudge bowls for 4 Mi'kmaq warriors in jail awaiting trial. They'd been arrested during the protests against fracking in New Brunswick. They were denied access to Indigenous spiritual services, just like Anthony Peter Paul, who'd been in the same jail the year before.
It's a charter right, it's a fundamental human right, and Constitution says that our Aboriginal rights are hereby recognized and affirmed.
Meanwhile, Peter Paul had taken action. He filed a complaint with the province's Human Rights Commission and won.
I felt that I did something with my time in jail, and I was able to help others like Native Spirituality is helping me.
In early 2017, he agreed to a settlement, $1,000 for Peter Paul, and the jail, along with the Department of Public Safety that oversees all the jails in New Brunswick, were to follow their own policy, to provide reasonable access without unreasonable delay. A condition of the settlement was that Peter Paul could not disclose the terms.
And I'm sure there's going to be more violations that happen.
At the time, APTN spoke with a Mi'kmaq elder who had concerns over that confidentiality clause.
There is no room for any accountability or transparency.
It's up to the jail to fulfill their obligations. And will they do it? They didn't do it in the past.
A year after winning that settlement, he found out firsthand. In 2018, Peter Paul was in jail again, a different jail, awaiting a court date to face robbery and break-and-enter charges. He asked to smudge and see an elder, and was denied again.
I was shocked and surprised. I thought for sure that I was going to be allowed to smudge, especially after what I just went through with the human rights complaint. You go to the chapel and they had a volunteer that came in and did church services, but there was nothing you could do for Native spirituality.
When APTN requested an interview with Peter Paul in the summer of 2018, he was transferred back to the first jail he'd been in years before, the same one named in his human rights complaint, and he was immediately allowed to smudge.
I believe that that's the whole reason that they allow us to smudge here now is because of that complaint, and it was against his place, and the jail's now sticking to their guns and doing what they said they were going to do in the settlement.
The human rights settlement was supposed to apply to all jails in New Brunswick. The province says smudge kits and other ceremonial resources are available, including the jail where Peter Paul was denied. The Dalhousie Correctional Centre sits directly across from a Mi'kmaq community, and it does have a sweat lodge.
I could see it right outside of my cell. It was the structure of a sweat lodge, but it wasn't being used.
It's not easy, being incarcerated. Back in the day when I was a teenager, I ended up being where they were at one time. And I did my time, I did 2 years. At that time they didn't have sweat lodges, they didn't have smudging, they didn't have anything that, was part of my culture to give them the strength that they need and help them out. For me to be able to bring that to them inside the Dalhousie jail, I'm grateful for that, to be able to do that. Water is very sacred because we need the water to do the sweats also. So I pray and give
Chris Wiseout is a Mi'kmaq spiritual caregiver. He built the sweat lodge at the Dalhousie jail and has volunteered to hold sweats for the men in custody.
I feel good that I made a difference in helping the clients there and helping the people out there.
But the lodge collapsed last year. Wiseout wants to rebuild it, but in the meantime...
There's no lodge there. We talked about going in to do some talking circles already. We haven't set up a time or date for that.
Wiseout doesn't get paid for his services at the jail. He doesn't want to be.
All right, let's go.
But there is a cost. Gas, supplies, even his time in a busy schedule of work and family.
Anything that they're willing to give me, just a thank you, just to see those guys come out of that sweat lodge and feel good about themselves, that is payment enough. That's enough for gratitude.
And Wiseout is keen to go back to the jail.
For me, it wouldn't be a problem to have them in the sweat lodge, but they have their own policies, they have their own rules, and changing their policy is the hardest thing to do.
When it comes to providing spiritual services and programs, there are challenges for provincial jails across the country. Security concerns, for one.
Well, the higher the security level, the more restriction there is on movement and association. So more time locked in cell, more time by yourself, less time to be engaged in any activity that's going to prepare you for release.
Howard Sapers is the former corrections watchdog for Canada.
The experience of Canadian Aboriginal people and the justice system has been described as Canada's national disgrace.
Until recently, Sapers was in Ottawa as the independent advisor on corrections for the Ontario government.
Institutions tend to be locked down more often than they need to be in Ontario. There are still significant staff shortages, both on the program side and on the security side.
Sapers released a series of reports on corrections reform. Part of the focus, how well Ontario jails do in providing Indigenous spiritual services.
It varies. There are contracts with elders, and elders are granted permission to work inside Ontario jails. But really, it's hit and miss. Those elder contracts are not always fulfilled. Elders complain about not being respected when they want to do their healing work. Indigenous men and women in custody complain that they have to often talk to a chaplain before they can access an elder. And for some people, that brings back terrible, terrible memories, particularly if they were involved in residential schools. While there are some very bright spots in Ontario, as there are in other jurisdictions across the country, overall, it's not a good news story.
Coming up after the break.
The Winnipeg Remand Centre does not offer sweat lodge ceremonies, pipe ceremonies, or even regular smudging. So they're really asking for services to help them with their spirituality.
I have to make another complaint now. I gotta contact Human Rights again, let them know that they're not following through with what they said they were going to do.
It really gives me a lot of compassion, because when I work with the people that are in the system, I don't look at them as criminals. I look at them as products and symptoms of colonization in residential school. And it's heartbreaking because I have family members, I have friends, I know people who are in the system who are not bad people, they just made bad choices.
Chantal Barker is the Director of Justice for the Southern Chiefs Organization in Winnipeg. She spent 10 years working for Manitoba Justice and has visited every jail in the province.
And it was very heartbreaking, and that's when I knew that something had to change. So we wanted to create a program that was specifically for Indigenous people, that addressed not only our history, but addressed the root causes of why some of our people were getting involved in the justice system and what we could do to get them out of the justice system.
Barker helped develop what's called the Culturally Appropriate Program, or CAP, for inmates. It's a 4-day program that looks at the impacts of residential schools, colonialism, cultural identity.
Many times, especially when it came to the CAP program, was like, well, how come this is the first time I'm learning about this? How come I never learned this in school? How come I had to come to jail to learn my identity, to learn my history, to learn my culture?
At age 46, Lance McIntyre has been in and out of provincial jails in Manitoba for much of his adult life.
Hi. Is Chantal Barker?
Yes, she is. I'll let her know that you're here. Hi, Chantal. You have someone here.
He's Cree, but he was part of the 60 Scoop and adopted out to a white family.
The thoughts I have now about the culture and everything like that, had they come up when I was, say, 18, I probably wouldn't have did half the things I did or been as incarcerated as long as I was.
McIntyre took part in Chantal Barker's cultural program when he was in jail 4 years ago.
Hello. Come on in.
He credits it for breaking his cycle of incarceration.
So hello, how are you?
Good.
That's great. It's changed your life for the positive. What resonated with you the most since taking the program?
Changed my life a lot. I mean, the biggest thing with that was identity, knowing who you are and where you came from. And that was given to me by the CAP program. And it was a build-up, and that was the push I needed.
But the program is on pause while it's updated by Manitoba Justice. For Barker, it's another gap in spiritual services.
There's no consistency across the different centers. You'll have one center you'll have 2 Aboriginal spiritual caregivers, and then a couple where there's none.
Barker says elders and spiritual caregivers are spread thin among hundreds of inmates whose requests go through the guards.
I don't think they understand the importance of it. It's kind of put on a back burner. Hurry up and wait. That's it. It is very frustrating, and then it's based on what's going on within the jail itself. I mean, if there's lockdown stuff like that, you know, obviously you're cut off from being able to have any access to someone like the elder.
If you're doing smudging every day, it helps. It cleanses me and helps me to ground myself. Can imagine what the clients could get out of it with themselves.
Chris Weissaut lives in the Mi'kmaq community of Listigouche, Quebec. He volunteers at a nearby New Brunswick jail. He says promising conversations with the jail superintendent have led nowhere.
I always ask if I can do talking circles on different topics, you know, and go into the jail and work on different things with the guys, and that still hasn't come up yet either.
And Weissaut says requests for his spiritual services don't seem to get through.
I had a cousin in there one time, and he made some requests. He told me afterwards that he wanted to see me and talk to me and stuff like that, but I never heard anything of it, so until afterwards.
So in policy, provincial and territorial jails allow access to Indigenous ceremony, to an elder, a smudge kit. But in practice, it's inconsistent. Something Anthony Peter Paul wants to change.
Maybe the government or the Human Rights Commission will, you know, force them to be accountable for not allowing natives to smudge.
So when he was denied for the second time, he filed a second human rights complaint. In British Columbia, an Indigenous man won a human rights case over access to spirituality in prison in 2011. But if a complaint doesn't go to a tribunal, confidentiality makes it hard to get a breakdown on how many inmates have filed or even settled complaints across the country.
Most of the time, people will just leave it alone. You can give yourself a bad name, you know, or get known as a complainer, and then, you know, you stop getting responded to on any level.
In the provincial system, people just have short times where they're in and out, and then they don't follow through with it.
For a sentence over 2 years, offenders are sent to a federal prison. Under 2 years, a provincial correctional center. But most people in provincial jails are there on remand, waiting for their court date.
If there's 7,500 men and women that'll sleep in an Ontario jail cell tonight, 5,000 of them or more will be on remand.
Howard Sapers says it's difficult to access prison programs on remand. The inmate hasn't actually been convicted, and like Peter Paul, they don't know how long they'll be in prison.
And so even if they were to access a program, chances are they won't complete it. And the idea would be to have that program bridged into the community. But that happens far too infrequently as well.
A year ago, inmates here at the Winnipeg Remand Centre wrote a letter asking for help.
They wanted access to Aboriginal spirituality. They wanted access to sweat lodges. They wanted access to education. I think something that stuck out for me, though, is the lack of accessing the Aboriginal spiritual caregiver. Several requests must be put in, and even then, it is never a for sure thing. He does great work here, but we are looking for consistent support that can help us finding our identity.
The letter was also sent to the Minister of Justice and the jail warden. APTN asked about the response, but Manitoba Justice didn't follow up. Barker says there was no action. What was the explanation?
Resources, space, those kind of things.
The whole picture changes in a federal prison like this one in Spring Hill, Nova Scotia, where I meet Anthony Peter Paul again.
Oh, it's a lot more like open. It's you're able to access more things. There's a lot of programs. There's a lot of stuff going on, and you're able to you know, do things to benefit yourself.
Peter Paul is here serving a 4-year sentence for the break-and-enter and robbery charges. He started an intensive program for Indigenous inmates.
Compared to the provincial system, there's absolutely nothing there for Aboriginal offenders. We got a medicine bundle here. We get sage, sweetgrass, and a lighter, and a red bundle to wrap it up in. We keep it right in our cells. We can smudge any time of the day.
Peter Paul heard back from New Brunswick's Human Rights Commission after he filed his second complaint about the lack of spiritual services in the Dalhousie jail. This time, his complaint was rejected.
I was really upset. I didn't expect it. I was kind of confused because it was I had enough evidence showing that I wasn't allowed to practice Native spirituality, and because it happened in the past, I figured that it's kind of a no-brainer. Complaint alleging race and creed. I feel that it's slightly biased, and they need to get it done with. It's all part of the systematic racism and that's been going on through the institutions.
Though he's not sure of the next steps, Peter Paul plans to keep fighting.
Here in the federal system, it's you're allowed. It's a right. It's a right, and they treat it as a right. But in the provincial system, it almost seems like it's a privilege over a right.
The New Brunswick Human Rights Commission can't comment on individual cases. The Department of Public Safety didn't make anyone available for an on-camera interview.
With provincial jails, they need to be on the same page as federal. Some of the trauma, some of the things that have been passed down, intergenerational trauma. And our people that are being put in prison and jail in the provincial jails are going through the same thing. So we need to be able to accommodate them in the same way.
In Ontario, Howard Saper's report makes several recommendations for corrections: engage elders and Indigenous communities, create an advisory committee.
But also create a standalone Indigenous Programs and Policy Division within the ministry, so that there is a very senior person, an assistant deputy minister in fact, who would be solely responsible for making sure that Indigenous issues were properly addressed.
In Manitoba, Chantal Barker wants to see Indigenous people have their own justice system with land-based healing centers rooted in culture.
You're not going to find it in correctional centers. You need to go back to the land and find out who you are, find out your purpose in life, and follow that path.
Well, I'm following the red path, and I started the healing journey, and I'm focusing on myself right now. Take advantage of the ability to smudge, speak with elders, to get out of here and never come back.